are 4 ways that the cervix changes during labor. One is ripening or softening, effacement or thinning, cervical position, and dilation. So I have a piece of silly putty here that I'm going to use to demonstrate the ways that the cervix can change. So the first way is probably the most abstract, and that is the position of the cervix. So before a woman goes into labor, when she's pregnant, usually the cervix is posterior, which means that it's further toward her back. A woman may know her cervix is posterior if she has a cervical exam and maybe it's really uncomfortable, or the provider says that they're having trouble reaching it. That's often because it's kind of back behind the uterus. As a woman's body readies for labor and labor progresses, the cervix will usually move anterior, which means that it's moving toward the front of the woman's body. So it kind of lines up better with the birth canal when it's in that position. So when a provider reports the cervical position to a woman, the provider will say that the cervix is either anterior, midline, or posterior. And you can just keep in mind that posterior usually means the cervix has a little bit more work to do to prepare for labor or during labor, and anterior is a more favorable cervical position for labor progress. The next way that the cervix changes is ripening and softening. So during the pregnancy, the cervix is pretty hard and thick, and that's to help keep the baby inside, because we don't want a woman to go into labor before her body is ready. But as the pregnancy progresses, and in the last few weeks of the pregnancy, the body makes hormones called prostaglandins, which help to soften the cervix. So if you can imagine, a soft cervix is much easier to thin and dilate than a really hard cervix. So as the cervix softens, you know that your body is getting ready for labor. So if a woman's provider checked her during her pregnancy at her prenatal visit and said, oh, maybe the cervix is closed and it's still pretty thick, but it's started to soften, that's a really good sign that the cervix is just preparing for labor. The last 2 ways that the cervix changes with contractions is effacement, which is also thinning of the cervix, and dilation, which is opening of the cervix. And I'm going to demonstrate some of that with this piece of silly putty here. So in a woman who is pregnant, or even not pregnant, the cervix is about 4 centimeters long, which is actually about the same size as this silly putty, which means that it's pretty thick. And it's not open at all, so there's no way to put one's finger into this or through it as you would be able to if it were a more open cervix. But either during labor or towards the end of the pregnancy, the cervix usually at first starts to thin out. Sometimes in a second or a third, or a woman who's had multiple pregnancies, the cervix is actually a little bit open all of the time. It never actually fully closes after she has the first baby. But for most women definitely having their first baby, the cervix is going to start to thin out before it does much dilating. And the prostaglandins, those hormones that help to soften the cervix at the end of pregnancy, are actually one of the things that are responsible for that. So you can just kind of see now that I'm starting to sort of thin out this cervix. As I'm thinning the cervix, I have a pencil. I'm going to actually put this pencil through it, and this is going to serve as an example of what the cervical os is. So the os is actually the part of the cervix that is open. It's basically the hole in the cervix that eventually the baby will come out of once the cervix is fully open. So this cervix right here is probably about, we would say, maybe 50% effaced. Now providers use different terms for effacement. Some providers will use 0 to 100%, whereas 0 is no effacement, so that thick cervix that we started with. 100% effaced means the cervix is paper thin, and eventually the cervix, we will get it to that point. Other providers use actual centimeters as a measurement of how effaced the cervix is. So they would say the cervix is, maybe it's 2 centimeters thick, and that would be equivalent to 50% effaced, roughly. And keep in mind, all of this is very subjective, which is why you might get checked by one person and they give you a specific exam, and then maybe you get checked again and there hasn't been much change, or maybe it seems like you've gone backward, and that is really just differences in providers' subjective experience of doing a cervical exam. So we'll just kind of continue to thin out the cervix, and thinning is actually a lot of work for the body, but once the cervix is completely thin, it's much easier for it to dilate, and our silly putty is going to kind of help us show that. So here we probably have a cervix that's about maybe 70 or 80% effaced, and you can see that it's starting to open a little bit more as it effaces, which actually kind of mimics how things are in real life. So this cervix, I can't quite get a finger through it, but I can kind of put my finger into it, which a provider would probably call that about a fingertip in terms of dilation. So we'll just kind of continue to do this. And if you were doing this at home, you would notice that the silly putty is getting very stretchy as it's thinning out, and that actually mimics a woman's real cervix, because a cervix that's nice and thin is really stretchy and can dilate much faster and easier than a cervix that's really thick. And so that's why for a lot of women that may be having an induction of labor, they'll use medications that can help to ripen or soften and thin out the cervix before they give something like Pitocin, which will primarily dilate the cervix. So we're just kind of thinning and stretching. This is sort of mimicking the way that a woman's body would actually do it. So we would say maybe this is about 90% effaced now, and then it depends on the provider's fingers, of course, but they're going to measure the cervix by putting 2 fingers inside of the vagina and then basically feeling how many fingers they can fit in, or how much is left around the edges of the cervix as the cervix progresses. So we would call this maybe like 2 centimeters, but of course, you know, it is pretty subjective. Then we're just going to keep kind of thinning and opening here, and this would all be, you know, the work that contractions are doing during labor. So we would call this maybe, this would maybe be like 5 to 6 centimeters. And as you can see, like when I measure with my fingers, it kind of stretches it, and it's like that in life as well. So sometimes a woman will go to the hospital and get checked, and the provider might say, oh, you're 5 centimeters, but I could stretch you to 6, and that just means that the cervix is at that point in labor where it's nice and stretchy. And this is just now really opening very easily. And you know, you can see here, this is where it's really not exactly like real life. So this is probably about 10 centimeters here. But in a woman's body, 10 centimeters is actually when the cervix is just completely gone. So it means that all of the cervix has been taken up into the uterus, and there's no cervix left, so the baby is just free to basically descend through the birth canal. Of course, we can't really do that with the model that we have here, but you can see this is about how big 10 centimeters is. So just to recap, the cervix does 4 things during labor or at the end of the pregnancy as it's getting ready for labor. It is going to ripen or soften. It's going to efface or thin out. It will change position, and then it will also dilate.